Okay, here we have some quality control measurements, and it looks like we've got 15 different materials, and we're just going to call them analyte 1 through 15. And these are the results of a series of measurements that were taken on each of those materials. And whatever instrument that was being used to make these measurements, we're trying to determine whether or not the precision of the measurements are within a certain acceptable tolerance. So one of the things that we're going to look at in conditional formatting is trying to figure out if we can spot any immediate outliers. Okay, so let's say that for each of these examples, this is my target concentration, 250 nanograms per mil, and these are what it's measuring. And let's say I want to flag anything that's outside, 20% of this number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert right here 2 rows. And I'm going to call this first one low and high. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say equal to 1 minus 0.2, which is 20%, times this number right here, B4, right? And so 1 minus 20%, that's basically 80%. I can just double check that by typing 0.8 times this number, right? And I get the same thing. Or I could say 1 plus 0.2 times this target number. So here I have my target value, and this is 80% of that, and this is 120% of that number. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to Control Shift down, go to Format, I'm going to go to New Rule, and I'm going to say Format cells that are not between those two values. So the first one, I'm going to have to scroll up here at the top, is between, so be between 200 and between 300. So if it's not between those or outside those, do something, and that's what this format is. So I'm going to fill it with this orange color, and I'm going to make the font kind of bold, and that's all I'm going to do. Now I'm going to hit OK. And what should happen is, if anything, so in this case 343 is greater than 300, so the format applies. And so let's see if we can find something on the low end. I'm going to change this value up here to 199, so that would be slightly lower, and you'll see that applies. Okay, so I'm going to copy this entire row. Again, go to Format, Manage Rules, and you'll see here that this says applies to B9 through 250. I actually want it to go from B9 to P, I think it's P250. So that should get the entire table. And one thing else I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this rule. Now, right now, the $ in front of B and 5 means that it's always locking to B5. I want this to happen to each column, but I want the low and high values to refer to the low and high values in that column, not specifically to B5 and B6. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to remove this first $ here. So the $ is meaning that it's locking. So I don't want it to lock to the column, but I do want it to lock to the row. So when it copies, I want it to copy across. So I'm going to do that on both sides here. And then let's see what happens. Boom. And so now this 6195 here is flagging because it's greater than 60. So that's a good way to spot your outliers. Now there's one more convenient thing about this. I'm going to jump over here a minute. And I've got this thing called %test. So if you remember when I made these formulas, I said the low end was, say, 80% of this number, and the high end was 120% of that. And so what instead I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this, and I'm going to select this 0.2 for 20%, and I'm going to replace it with this, and then I'm going to lock it with F4. Now, what that's going to do is it's now going to be giving me the same number. But because it's now locked to this, if I were to change this to 15%, you'll notice that this automatically changed. Because I can lock it to that cell, so now it's going to be, instead of 1 plus 0.2, it's going to be this number here, F4 to lock it. I'll change that back to 20%. Now, if I copy this formula across, these formulas, the high and low, is always referencing this 20%. So I can stand back and say, look at all these numbers and say, well, how would these be changed if instead of using a plus or minus 20% as how I identify an outlier, what if I want it to be 10%? Now I can just type this in and everything will update. I say, well, what about 30%? Okay, and all of my outliers will update automatically. So that's how you can use conditional formatting in different types of applications.